Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about, well, books that are not The Wheel of Time, which is really cool because it's way more fun. Yes, I'm still on my break between those two Wheel of Time novels. And I'm still in lockdown, not lockdown, but isolation because I technically have the plague right now. So I spend that time reading books and talking about it, which is really good. I'm privileged that I have basically no symptoms at all. Anyway, if you're new here, welcome. I talk about books most of the time. I'm disorganized and ramble. If you like it, however, I'd be much obliged if you could actually, subscribe, like, and whatnot. It makes me feel good, is what it is. And yes. So today I want to talk about a book that I really enjoy by an author that I really enjoy, but I'm a bit nervous to talk about, and I'll try to weave that into it as well. I'm talking about Thomas Pynchon and the novel Inherent Vice from 2009. I just reread it yesterday all day. I did nothing else. And I want to talk about it a bit because I feel it might just be the best approach, access point for Thomas Pynchon as a writer. If you ever been curious to read Pynchon, this might just be the one that makes it easy to get into his stuff, and that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about this one first, and maybe about others later. It's time to get this started, and because I forgot about this for a long time, I'm gonna revive this custom. I do have a Patreon. You're not obliged to, you're not required to back or anything, but I have a new backer. It's Ollie from Poland, although currently in the US, I think. Anyway, it's Ollie, and thank you for being a patron. And this one goes out to you, even though it's not a Polish beer because I'm, in lockdown. I have to drink what I can find. This one goes out to you. Cheers, my friend. Cheers. All right, let's talk about Inherent Vice by Thomas Pynchon. I'll split it into the non-spoiler quick summary, and then I'll talk about all the good bits. I will say, however, there won't be actual plot spoilers or a lot of them in the later book because a Thomas Pynchon novel is not about plot spoilers. So if you don't mind that, you might actually, gain something from this even before reading the novel because it's that kind of book. Is what I'm trying to say here. So yeah, Thomas Pynchon, famous American author, super highbrow, or maybe, and all of that. And one of his, it's currently second to last novels is Inherent Vice from 2009, and it takes place in 1970, I think. In 1970, and it is rather short. And it's a detective story. It's a almost noir, hard-boiled kind of detective story in style, taking place in 1970 and deals with the mysterious disappearance, kidnapping, or whatever of a, real estate millionaire and his possible girlfriend, lover, or whatever, who is the ex-girlfriend of our main character, Larry Sportello, and then things spiral into paranoia and chaos from there because it's a Thomas Pynchon novel. So there you have it. That's what it is about. It's short. It deals with the end of the hippie era and what comes afterwards, and it is mostly a fun detective story with lots of pop culture references, jokes, and deeper themes. All right, this is why you should read it. It's absolutely fantastic. It's short, it's fun, and it's all over the place. If you don't want spoilers, this is where you need to click off, get yourself the book, spend an educational weekend, and then come back and join the discussion. If you don't mind spoilers, just stay here. All right, read it? Perfect. Let's talk. And let's start with the first thing. And Thomas Pynchon has this kind of reputation that a lot of authors that I personally enjoy have. And that is to be very, very complex. You know, it's the kind of an author that people call, like, you know, capital L, serious American literature, all of that crap, right? People in academia with actual titles talk about that guy. People, writers, pretentious writers or critics in magazines that cost a lot of money, write reviews of that stuff. It's sort of one of those people that you're like, oh, they might win a Nobel Prize and all of that stuff. And for someone like me, who mostly reads fantasy and science fiction, historical fiction, that kind of stuff, it always feels almost like I'm not educated enough to read those kind of books, or even if I'm reading them, I'm probably not qualified to talk about those kind of books. And then I thought about it, I was like, what fucking impulse is that? It's like, of course I have the right to talk about it, right? I read the book, I have the right to an opinion. And that's where we are right now. And I feel it's interesting to actually look at that impulse of, like, me feeling bad for talking about this, or being more nervous to talk about this kind of book than sitting down and talking about, I don't know, Wheel of Time, which I'm absolutely not nervous to trash. It's like, no, there's no reason for that, except for the fucking system out there, for the things that we get, like, pushed into believing, that tendency to accept authority, whatever authority it is, imaginary authority most of the time, and so forth. And this is a good point to actually enter the world of Thomas Pynchon and his kind of books, because his books are all about questioning that in a lot of ways, in, like, the themes, the stories, and even the way he writes. And I feel that's one of the things that I want to go back to later in this discussion, is like how he actually questions all of these kind of things. So why this one first? And look, I've read a bunch of Thomas Pynchon novels. I started out, when I read the first one, which I definitely need to reread, it was Against the Day. It's from, like, I think 2003 or 4. It's very long. It has your, you know, Brandon Sanderson length kind of book. It is sprawling all over the place. I guess it's like second or longest novel. Either that one or Gravity's Rainbow are the really big ones. And Mason and Dixon is also relatively long, which I have read all of those. I read those three. I read The Crying of Lot 49, which is probably the other good entrance point. It's an older one, and it's really short. And I've read Vineland, and I've read, what's it called? The last one, Bleeding Edge. And I still believe that this one might just be the easiest, the most accessible one, because it has a plot. It's not an important plot, but it does have one, which is why I'm going to say this one is probably a better entrance point than Crying of Lot 49, because it it leans so much on the idea of the, you know, Philip Marlowe kind of hard-boiled detective kind of story. In a lot of ways, and plays with those conventions and so forth. It still has to follow, at least in part, the structure of a detective story. There's a case to be solved, the disappearance of Mickey Wolfman. That is sort of the through line. We have one main character, which is something we rarely have in Thomas Pynchon novels, right? We have, well, in Bleeding Edge, you also have one, what's her name, Maxine something or other, like one main character. But, like, in the larger books, right? Yeah, and Oedipa Maas is, like, more or less the only character in Crying of Lot 49. But in a lot of his other books, it's sprawling. We have lots of characters, lots of, like, bits and pieces that are all over the place, and it's easier to follow someone like, you know, Doc Sportello, trying to solve a specific case. And it's relatively straightforward compared, I feel, to Crying of Lot 49, which is the other good entrance point. We have a very specific point in time, that being the end of the hippie era, right after the killings of Charles Manson and his gang, right? We have a very specific point in time. We have a very specific location, that being Greater LA. And all of that makes it relatively easy. It's not jumping all over the place. And that helps, I guess. Plus, it is fairly lighthearted compared to some other books of Thomas Pynchon's. And it deals with all the main themes that Pynchon often deals with in a fairly straightforward way, because the end of the hippie era is one of those, like, very, very specific points in time where eras shift, where we have like a paradigm shift or like something like that. And those are things that Thomas Pynchon tends to look at. Those like fault lines, those break lines in what you might call history, or how we as humans think about the world, basically. And when you look at his novels, a lot of them are exactly about those kind of points, which I guess is sort of why maybe Crying of Blood 49 doesn't really adhere to that much. But you have like, Bleeding Edge, which is all about like 9/11 and what it does to people. We have this one, which is all about, Manson, the rise of Nixon, the rise of Ronald Reagan, that kind of stuff, the rise of conservatism as a reaction or to the counterculture. It's something that is very typical for Thomas Pynchon in general, with Gravity's Rainbow. It's very much the end of World War II and what that does to the world, basically. And with Against the Day, it's that break in time is World War I, for example. So it's something that we see a lot. These like breaks, or what Thomas Pynchon, I guess, perceives as breaks in human history, or Western history in this case. Like, it's very much a Western or North Atlantic, mostly even American-focused breaks in American history in a way. And yes, the other part that I already mentioned is because we all know the detective story, the hard-boiled, even if we haven't read our Marlowe novels, if we hadn't read The Big Sleep or anything like that, we still have in our mind that idea of how that kind of story works. We know the tropes, and that makes it easier to access this one to compare to some others, because we're much more, like most of us will be aware of those tropes and realize what Pynchon is doing with them and how he's like dealing with them. So that's why I think it's a very good point to access and start your journey into the writings of Thomas Pynchon with this one. And it's just a lot of fun. So let's talk at like some of the things that I think are, also paradigmatic. We can see very clearly like the style, because it's one of the last Thomas Pynchon novels. We see his style very explicitly, like his way of writing books, his prose that does very specific things that are, I don't want to say uniquely Pynchon, but very postmodern, modern American novel style. One of them is the enumeration and exaggeration. I want to look at that for a second. So what Pynchon often does is he writes in general like in very long, convoluted, winding sentences, which I personally really approve of, because I study philosophy. I like reading that kind of stuff. I tend to write and read and talk in extremely long sentences as well that wind on and on and on. So I personally just really vibe with this, and that's cool. It's groovy. But what he also does a lot of times, and this is like a very specific tool, a literary tool that he uses a lot. Some other people might know it from other authors. German authors might know it from Walter Mörs. German readers might know it from Walter Mörs, who uses it a lot as well. I guess he was maybe inspired by Pynchon, or just like follows the same kind of rules. But here's what I mean. Thomas Pynchon oftentimes builds sentences that turn into like an enumeration of like things that are somewhere. Like he starts out, you go to this valley and you see all these people and 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 these people. It's a long enumeration, and it gets wilder and more unrealistic and crazier by the item. Or he just like takes a long list of very realistic things that you see somewhere, and then he just drops in like one or two completely unrealistic bits and pieces in there in the middle, which is sort of where the exaggeration bit comes in. Thomas Pynchon takes a lot of like very classic human behaviors, things that are very realistic, and then he just like blows them up to like unrealistic proportions, unrealistic craziness. One of those situations being in this book, and this is like scene, it's not exactly a spoiler or anything, but here we are. At some point, Doc's friend Dennis, but everyone pronounces it Dennis because it then rhymes with penis, which is very much how it is explained in the book. And trust me, it is very realistic in that specific area of, hippies, surfers, and people that smoke a lot of weed. That would, of course, people would exactly do that. It feels realistic. And he falls asleep with a joint and sets his bed on fire, but he's still super stoned and doesn't realize what to do and so forth. And then luckily the flames burn a hole into the roof of his place and melt the waterbed above his upstairs neighbor, and the water just flows down and, well, defeats the fire, which is really cool and absurd. Now, I don't know how many of you have had contact with people that take a lot of drugs and stuff, smoke a lot of weed and whatnot, and yeah. The beginning of this story is extremely realistic, and then it just becomes more and more preposterous. And there's lots of these bits and pieces in this book that are hilarious on the surface level, but then also, over the top and realistic. It's what every stupid stoner comedy later on is kind of building on, but Pynchon does it in an even more preposterous way, because he then drops the convention of this being a hyper-realistic novel, like a serious, realist novel, by just leaning all the way into the paranoia and shifting those borders, which is the next bit we need to talk about here. So first bit, as a very specific style tool to have long enumerations in his sentences, and he does that all the time, and then exaggeration, having a Dennis, once again, eating a pizza with papaya and pork rind and other stuff. It's, doesn't make any sense, but it plays on the whole, stoners, eating everything and, and then just, leaning into that. So that's that very specific thing that you see with Thomas Pynchon in almost all of his novels. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Now, with this specific topic, that being the late 60s, early 70s, surfer, dropout, whatever kind of community in LA, he can obviously lean into the stoner jokes a lot. And he does that, and that's really funny. So let's look at the next bit. He that is breaking out of the idea of the realist novel. Thomas Pynchon novels are not technically realist, or they blur the lines. Some more, some less. And now that's something that you can see all the way back in American literature, not only in American literature, in literature generally, right? When you have suddenly bits of fantastic things, creep into the story, right? You have your Moby Dick has elements of that. When you switch, you drop in bits and pieces songs, bits of a theater play, movie script parts, all of that. You see that in Moby Dick. You see it in another German one that I mentioned here because it's recently got a new movie adaptation, Berlin Alexanderplatz. It's another one of those that just adds these bits and pieces of other forms of literature into the whole thing to, once again, break the reader out of just following a story, because it's very much more than that. It's about an experience in a lot of ways. And of course we have this here. Pynchon generally loves to put in song lyrics into stories. He does that a lot. Some are real songs that he just quotes. Some are made up songs that have all kinds of dumb jokes in there. He likes to do that as well. It's something that we see here. But I wanted to talk about the other side of this, and this is when the fantastic or the super realistic or supernatural, whatever you want to call it, bleeds into the story. Now, here's the thing. Thomas Pynchon likes to deal with the question of paranoia and the paranormal, because those are connected, right? It's and the idea of you can never tell whether people are paranoid and are imagining things, or these things are real. At least that's sort of what we see in a lot of his a lot of Pynchon novels, where stuff happens that science would tell you cannot happen. But then again, there's always the question are the people telling these things, or the people experiencing these things, are they fully there, or are they on drugs? Well, in this case, they're all on drugs. You look at Inherent Vice, you see like everyone smoking weed and taking acid all the fucking time. So when they go to this house where they surf band, the boards are, and they at some point realize that everyone in this house are zombies. It's like, is that just like drug fueled paranoia? Or is this real? When they later talk about the fact that like they brought an exorcist in to cleanse all of them, and all of the stuff is back to normal again. It's like, is that true or not? Is that imaginary? And it's the strength of a lot of Pynchon novels that we never like get a definitive answer. It's always, this is a possibility. There is more out there than just what we get through science. There's more out there. There's other worlds. There's parallel universes, or whatever you want to call it. There is the paranormal and the supernatural in a way. But that just means that there are things out there that are not rational, that cannot be explained rationally, that should not be explained rationally, because the irrational is part of human nature, which is once again one of those big themes of Thomas Pynchon's books a lot of the times, that struggle against the rational to give room to the irrational, whether it's your like secret postal service Tristero in Crying Out Lot 49, whether it's the slow fading of Tyrone Slothrop in Gravity's Rainbow, whether it's in this case, the zombies and the parallel stuff, the rise of Lemuria in, or not rise of Lemuria, we don't really know, in Inherent Vice. It's always there, that other world, that darker world that you can connect probably to, all kinds of the subconscious and all of this stuff. It's always there. And, well, once again, with the hippie era, this is easy to tie in. And I think this is one of the reasons why it works so well in Inherent Vice, is we're talking about an era where that is a fact, where a lot of people believe in astrology and like the rise or sinking of Atlantis and Lemuria and all of these aspects of spirituality. They are part of the world that Pynchon is describing there, and because he's radically within that world. He's not describing it from the outside. It's radically from Doc's perspective in a lot of ways. We totally, as I said, he takes it seriously. And that makes it so interesting, because on the one hand, not rational, but hyper-rational people like you and me, some of us at least, if we don't believe in astrology, we can still be aware of the fact that astrology and spirituality in a lot of ways were an important part of the psychedelic 60s. In a lot of ways, they were just like an integral part of that counterculture. And that is, so it makes sense in that way. But when you read it the way it is written with Doc and people in this book, it's like it's just part of the world. It's like, yeah, who knows? Maybe it is because of the wrong angle between Uranus and Neptune or whatever. These people take it seriously, and thus it is actually what is true within that radical world. So there we go with that. Let's look at some of the other big things that make this a very Pynchon novel. Pop culture. Pynchon novels are always about pop culture. They've always been, and that's one of the reasons they appeal to me, because I like my pop culture references, whether it's my Umberto Eco, my Discworld. Terry Pratchett is huge in that regard, whether it's this one, Pynchon, or there's more, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace goes into like a similar direction, right, in that regard. I like those bits and pieces, and there's reasons why I like them. One of them is like, in general, I like pop culture. So people acknowledging all those aspects of both highest highbrow culture and surf rock and weird pop culture references And it's just cool to see all of that in there and to go and find out whether those references are true or not. Now, this is a very interesting aspect of it, right? It's like you can go and there's like Thomas Pynchon wikis out there that like go through every single word and figure out what possible jokes and references could be in there. And it can be highly entertaining and educational to actually go through all of that. But it can also be fun to just like read it and see what stuff you actually recognize, which jokes you get, which jokes you don't get, which jokes you get without knowing whether they're like made up or actually real. Because there's a lot of research, a lot of details, like really weird details in these novels. Once again, the same with something like someone like Umberto Eco. He's sort of, in a lot of ways, deals with similar themes, topics, and elements like Thomas Pynchon, just in a more European, say a continental, stately way. He rarely goes all in, like Thomas Pynchon in that regard. It has like a slower pace oftentimes, whether it's Name of the Rose or I guess Baudolino is probably one of the more closer to Pynchon, as is Foucault's Pendulum in a way. Once again, paranoia, conspiracy, those aspects are huge with both authors, so that makes a lot of sense. All right. As pop culture plays a huge role in most of his books. Bands show up. There's references to all kinds of obscure movies and stuff, explicitly within the text and then as jokes. And yeah, maybe Spotted Dick, the English rock band, is a dumb joke about just like English food, Spotted Dick, or a joke about Cream, the other English band at the time. Possible, who knows? But it's funny. And it shows in a way that pop culture, or what we call pop culture derisively oftentimes, because it still has this like disparaging sound. It's like, this is culture and this is pop culture. So no, it's culture. And to take it seriously as an element of your literary work is, I think, hugely important. All right, next bit. What more is interesting about this book? What makes it such a good example for Thomas Pynchon's writing? The overall political struggle. Now, I've always said that I'm a political person. I think all art is political at its heart. So all books are political and should be read as political texts in a way, or should be read as also being political. Thomas Pynchon is explicitly political because, most of his novels are set in our world. They are set in specific political, eras of history and deal with those historical elements. You do that, you make political statements. And Thomas Pynchon's big theme in most of, or almost all of his books, is that struggle between the rational, the irrational, the human and the inhuman, the fight of the underdog against the machine, the struggle of the human to become, to be free of the machine being, in that case, capitalism, and all these capitalism and fascism in a lot of ways, or all these structures that Pynchon deems to be both capitalist and fascist, because he seems to see those two as being fairly connected in a lot of ways, and the idea that the system, the machine, will always grind down any form of rebellion, any form of true freedom and liberty in a lot of ways, which makes a lot of sense. And this book obviously makes this very explicit. We have the end of the hippie era, the rise of Ronald Reagan as governor of California, in the background already the rise of Richard Nixon, and the way that the psychedelic 60s die with Charles Manson's attacks and the crackdown against drug use, which, and this is once again, it's really cool and political, which connects to the whole question of racism in America, and how the fight against drugs is even back then connected with the fight against civil rights and the likes. And yes, this is, as I said, quintessential Thomas Pynchon right there. Yeah, but racism is systemic because one of the big things in that general like theme that Pynchon always views is the fact that the oppression of minorities, or what you might call minorities, or disadvantaged groups, is part of how that system keeps running, apart from many other things like corruption and so forth, and which is where, the whole capitalism aspect comes into it. And now, don't get me wrong, Thomas Pynchon is not writing a great analysis of the of the evils of capitalism. He just shows how these trickle into every single small aspect of human life if we let it. And what he usually does, and he does very well in this book, is to look at attempts of escape from that. In this case, the counterculture in this case, the hippie era in the 1960s in mostly LA, and how that is then ruthlessly, and this is the thesis there, that the system will strike back, and it will strike back ruthlessly, and it will exploit aspects of human nature and the darker sides of irrationality, whether it's drug abuse. One of the main characters here, Coy Hollingen, who has to, or works for these kind of people as a subversive element in that situation to get out of his drug abuse. And it's the awareness of the fact that if you believe in the less rational side of human nature, if you believe in freedom for that less rational side of human nature, you need to be aware of the fact that that system out there that is trying to that is trying to put us all into boxes and give us numbers to make everything calculable and so forth, is a ruthless enemy that will strike back at every small bit and piece of freedom. There's a very interesting short bit on that with the beginnings of ARPANET, right? They're talking about the ARPANET and how one of the private investigators is using early computers to get stuff, to find stuff out and so forth. And he's like, it feels like a trip almost in new senses and whatnot, just like acid. And then Doc is like, yeah, well, so what do you think when they'll actually ban it or make it illegal? And it's like, well, what happens is that as soon as we found out that acid brought us information or things that we shouldn't see, they made it illegal. So what do you think they'll do with the the internet, basically, in this situation? And obviously, the internet didn't get banned, but it got corrupted by capitalism. You look at the internet now compared to the early anarchist parts of the Usenet and so forth. Yeah, it got taken over by the machine just as much as everything else. Now, obviously, writing this in 2009, Thomas Pynchon is well aware of that, which is part of how those jokes work. Which brings us to another big aspect of what we see here, anachronism. Thomas Pynchon doesn't give a fuck about time or, these kind of things. He makes jokes that totally make no sense in 1970, right? He calls one department, he plays with acronyms, with acronyms a lot. That's something he likes to do. And, against the day, he has the true worshippers of the ineffable tetrahedron, which is TWIT for short. And here he has one of the police departments of, I keep forgetting what it was, but they are called the P. Diddies. Now, of course, that joke does work in 2000s, but it's anachronistic. And he does a lot of that anachronism to make, once again, go towards the idea of this all being sort of holistic. There's connections within art that transcend what you might call that rigid adherence to time. And what else is interesting here? Well, as I said, racism as a part of the system to keep the people in line is a huge part of it. The anti-drug policies are a huge part of it. As I said, it's put into context of the 1970s. But I feel it all leads to a larger thing, and this is the next bit that I want to talk about. Once again, it's what Thomas Pynchon does as a writer. It has been said, and I feel this is, once again, one of the things where Thomas Pynchon is always also a statement about art and about literature in particular. And I've said this before. One of the strengths of literature, it doesn't have to be fantasy or science fiction, right? Like books in general, is that you can express things there that other forms of media, maybe more capitalized, or whatever, other forms of media don't allow. You can say things in books that you can do things in books that you cannot do in movies. Now, get me wrong, you can do more or less everything that happens in a fantasy novel, per se, in a movie, given an infinite budget. But budget is not what I mean here. It's stuff that we accept in one art form that we don't accept in another art form, that we, crossing borders, or, crossing red lines that, like, the more that movies, the TV industry, the movie industry, even the computer games industry will not allow, because they are more of an industry. Don't get me wrong, publishing is another industry, but there's things that you can get away with there that you can't get away with in other aspects. And Thomas Pynchon is very much pushing at those boundaries, very much trying to break those rules, and always trying to find more things that you cannot say anywhere else. Now, this is, I think, interesting, and it's important to make sure that this is not about triggers. This is very much not about triggers in the sense that triggers should be used. It is very much about something else, and that's that constant, like, discussion, or like the struggle against attempts to also co-opt art and literature. And this is where I feel the Thomas Pynchon phenomenon kind of becomes interesting, because, as I said at the beginning, Thomas Pynchon novels have the reputation of being complex, have the reputation of being art, of being high literature. They are usually, they're discussed in academia. They are reviewed and discussed in the arts pages of your more highbrow magazines, journals, and whatnot. That's where people hang out that read Thomas Pynchon. And I feel, and looking at other aspects of how the system works, that class of people, the class of people that read books to claim that they have read them, the class of people, the group of people that showcase all their books on, like, their, bookshelves to impress people, the class of people that read those kind of magazines, have, up to a point, made them their intellectualism in a lot of ways, have made that part of, that image to, showcase their superiority, to have, like, pretentious discussions on all kinds of, like, aspects of these books and whatnot. And Thomas Pynchon is, I feel, in a lot of his texts, is constantly struggling against that in a lot of ways. Putting stuff in there, it oftentimes, not so much with this one, certainly with other books, it oftentimes feels like he's trying to see how far he can go with just talking about pop culture, with just talking about, we're talking about, a very explicit sexuality. Well, not so much in this one, but as I said, in others, more so. How explicit out there with very, very fetishized aspects of fetish and whatnot, he can go and still be considered highbrow literature by those people that have made being highbrow part of their image, of their way of projecting superiority. Because let's not forget it, that part of intellectualism is a privilege. It's something for the high, for the rich people, because education is fucking expensive. A complex education is even more fucking expensive. Don't get me wrong, I'm privileged in that regard. I know I'm part of the problem there. But you know what I mean? And it is always a struggle against that. It's like, no, these books are for everyone. And it's always about also somewhat giving the finger to those people that go and listen to classical music just because it is important to be seen at those places, to be seen as someone who likes complex things. And I feel that's part of it. And that's what it's what I'm trying to say when I connect it back to what I started out with. It's like me sitting there is like, am I even, qualified to talk about this book? because I haven't studied literature. Am I even allowed to? It's like, that's exactly that fucking system trying to, because it's so easy to actually take that in with all the stuff we learn when we grow up, all the stuff we get told over time and so forth. And it feels like these books are always very much about the struggle against that, and to take your freedom to do whatever the fuck you want at the end of the day, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video, right? It's like to tell all of you people, no matter what you believe, go read that fucking book. If you enjoy it, that's fine. You don't have to be an expert in pop culture or in communist theory or in anything else. You want to read a fun story about stoners getting paranoid and solving a crime? Go read that book. It's fun. It doesn't have to be about your education or anything else. So that's a huge part of it. Now let's look at one or two of the other really important strengths of the book. Irony and sincerity is a big one, right? Thomas Pynchon always has a lot of irony in his text. It's just the way he writes, the way he jokes around with anachronisms, with these really dumb dad jokes about funny acronyms and shit like that. Just the way his prose sometimes works, the way he, builds these exaggerations and stuff. A lot of this feels extremely ironic, distanced almost. It's easy to read those things, lean back and just laugh about it and not take it seriously. And this is where I feel the strength of a lot of these books comes from, is that all the time, and this is, I guess, where we really have to talk about the fact that Thomas Pynchon is a master of his craft, is a master of language. At every single moment in those books, there's always the chance, and he uses them a lot, for him to just flip the entire feeling on its head and make this actually hit extremely hard emotionally. Now, a lot of these emotions are about, regret, melancholy, missed chances, that kind of stuff, especially in this book, but it is always there. And when he tries to talk about the really complex aspects of a relationship, he's able to do that in a lot of ways as well, right? You have that story with Corey Hollingen and his wife, and it starts out as really extreme graphic craziness plus drug abuse and other stuff. The kind of thing you could see in a very early Quentin Tarantino or Robert Rodriguez movie, right? That kind of craziness. And then flip it into a really heartwarming story about how people try to actually do the right thing and get their shit together and maybe fail or don't fail and process these kind of things. And that's one of the really important strengths of these books, is that at any point, while this is a lot of fun and it's all about the absurdity of human existence and maybe the hopelessness of fighting against the system that is trying to keep us down, at the end of the day, it's about the human and the human condition and trying to survive in this absurd universe out there and trying to keep alive and do things kind of right. Which, is also the overarching, backstory, right? With Mickey Wolfman trying to do the right thing, trying to give away, and this is the other big theme here with property, right? How property is part of the system's way to keep down, to oppress minorities, to discriminate against already discriminated people. The way, property prices are part of that. Taking out, Black or Hispanic neighborhoods and building, houses for white people there, and forcing people out of, out there into the, onto the fringes and stuff. It's a huge background to all of this, and you read this book, it certainly is written with the knowledge of the 2000s, but it very much shows in a lot of small bits and pieces how the foundation, or if not the foundations, but at least a huge building block of the situation we face these days is exactly laid in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s. And you have that one person who's like, you know what, I'm sorry for all the crimes I have committed against humanity by being a real estate mogul doing all these things. I'll just use my money to build a city with free housing where anyone could just go. And then you see the system, dragging Mickey Wolfman back in and just taking these bits out and down and, making it, to keep the system running, basically, which is part of like the behind the thing, right? And this, I guess, is sort of where we'll end it with the paranoia, because the other like large message here is that while paranoia, is sometimes just paranoia and drugs and whatnot, it doesn't mean that nothing is happening. The whole old maxim, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that no one's after you. And that we also always have to keep vigilant, because a huge theme there is that no, the hippie era, the psychedelic 60s did not end because of Charles Manson or any specific, event around the year 1970. They ended because all the while people were very much engrossed with themselves and that little bit of freedom that they tried to find all the time, the system, the machine, those people in power that don't want humanity to change, were digging at it in the background, or maybe we lost vigilance and were not aware of it at the time. And this is, I think, the important lesson there is like, read Thomas Pynchon, be aware of the fact that there is a larger world out there, that art as an expression of the irrational can always be there as the freedom out there, the way to give the finger to the man, to the system, to do all of that. But be aware that while you're doing this, and while it's fun to do that, and is vital to being human in a way, it also means that we need to be aware of the fact that the system will always try to corrupt and to co-opt that little bit of freedom and turn it into, well, part of the system again. How they took away the internet. It's how they made, any art form into a product over the long run. And the fact that this still, continues today is just, part of it. And the fact that Pynchon, at the end of the day, is also subject to the publishing industry in a lot of ways, is that weird tension that underlies the whole process, right? I mean, it's a mess, but it's a glorious mess. And I feel reading these books will make you a better person. It will certainly give you a lot of enjoyment, a shit ton of really good jokes, really good quotes, and, well, stuff that you probably can't even post on Twitter or Facebook or anything these days as quotes. And that's sort of like the victory of art against the system. It's right there. Go read it. If you have read it, let me know what you think. Shall we talk about more Pynchon novels in the future? Let me know. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend. Cheers.